intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. Yes, I am back. We have been on a fairly extensive tour of both Israel and Rome, and so I'm back in the chair here and looking forward to the interviews we're going to be doing today. I'll, for the first hour, have a chance to talk about this vote that just took place on impeachment procedures. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then in the next hour, we'll have Jim Denison in studio with us. We'll talk about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the attack on him and the success and what that means in terms of defeating ISIS, and he has already written quite a bit on that. So is his son, Ryan Denison, so we'll be talking about that with him. Talking about impeachment, how we think about this, and I do acknowledge that Halloween is today, so we'll spend a moment or two from his commentary, which really isn't so much about Halloween as it is about the number of people who believe in ghosts and believe they've had contact with ghosts. I think I have an answer for that from a biblical point of view, but we'll save that for him in the next hour. Then I might mention in our third hour, although you will not maybe be able to hear that on your local station, you can simply listen to it on the Point of View app, on, of course, our website, pointofview.net, or even Facebook Live. We'll have Todd Starnes with us. He'll be finishing off the last half hour of the program. His new book, Cultural Jihad, How to Stop the Left from Killing a Nation, a collection of many things he's been writing about. And again, a half an hour will just barely touch the surface of some of the material he has in this excellent book. So we're going to cover a lot of information and do a lot of different interviews. And at the same time, we'll also, of course, get ready for our Friday weekend edition. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford will be with me. Mark your calendars. That'll be the first time in a long time. All three of us have been in the studio together, so we look forward to that. And I can't go any further without saying congratulations to the Washington Nationals. This is the difficulty of traveling because, as I was sharing with Andrew, I had to watch the highlights of the World Series on YouTube, and that's not quite the same, but nevertheless, what is it about home field advantage? I thought there was supposed to be a home field advantage, and yet it seems like you always seem to do better in someone else's ballpark. It reminded me of the story I've told most of the time to my wife, because nobody else will listen to it, about Madison Bumgarner, who was actually one of those pitchers for the San Francisco Giants, who actually has a better record in opposing ballparks than in his own. And you wouldn't think that would be the case, but nevertheless, it's just another one of those interesting phenomenon. And you've got to go all the way back to the Washington Senators to see a victory in Washington, D.C. So brought together lots of people. In fact, we might talk about that a little bit with Jim Denison, if for no other reason, since he's been a Houston Astros fan. Got to bring that up maybe in the next hour. But also, it's one of those times where sports sometimes brings people together. But that's not what we're finding right now with the vote. The decision came down today to vote on impeachment procedures. And if you have not watched the news, let me just give you the numbers. 232 to 196 for not voting on agreeing to the resolution. Now, as you might imagine, it split completely down party lines. 231 Democrats voting for it, 2 against, 194 Republicans voting against it. Again, there were a couple non-votes in that. And the only person that even was close to being a Republican is Justin Amash, who is now an independent, but at one point was with the Republican Party, and Independent for Michigan voted for it. So you had 231 Democrats, 1 independent, for a total of 232. Just reading from the Hill for just a minute, just to give you some context in that regard. It says the House today took a first major step towards making Donald Trump just the third president in history to be impeached, approving procedures for an inquiry likely to burst into full public view in weeks. The measure, which establishes rules for open hearings and questioning of witnesses by members and staff, passed, as I just mentioned, by a vote of 232-196. Party line voting, with just 2 Democrats voting against it, no Republicans supporting it. Democrats who voted no, by the way, in case you're curious, Representative Colin Peterson from Minnesota, Jefferson Van Drew from New Jersey. Both represent districts, by the way, that were won by Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And, of course, I mentioned our independent that voted for it. Democrats cast the vote as a serious step that upheld the House's constitutional role as an independent branch of the government. This comes from the Hill. I think that's overstepping their bounds, but we'll leave it where it is. Nancy Pelosi said this is something that is very solemn, that's something very prayerful. That's the speech she gave before the vote. What is at stake is all of this is nothing less than our democracy. Now, again, I want to give an opportunity to hear from some of the others, because you have, for example, the Republican minority leader, which would be Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, and other members repeatedly pointed to statements made by rank and file Democrats at the beginning of Congress that suggested the party was focused on removing Trump from office from the very start. And I might just point that out for just a minute. Where did I put this? There it is. This is an article that, for those of you watching online, is easy to find. And this came out months ago now, but it was, at the time, a summary of 86 things Democrats said Trump could be impeached for. And these came out before, well, actually all but 2 of them came out before there was any news about Ukraine. So as you look through this, starting as early as February 1st, you had various individuals already calling for the impeachment of the president, quite a number in November, then a few in March, some in April, quite a number in May. This is 2017, by the way, not this year. That just shows you how long it goes. So from February 2017 to then, in this case, September 25th, 2019, which then would include the idea of coercing a foreign government. So you have all but 2 of these. So I guess you would say 80. Here they have 89, and this one has 86. So I guess some of them are repeats. So again, 86 of those possibly were then put forward as reasons for impeaching the president, even before we ever heard about Ukraine. And so the point that was made by Kevin McCarthy and a number of other Republicans is easily verified by this particular document. And I just thought I'd hold it up in case any of you want to read it at your leisure and realize how many times people that are Democrats have said the president should be impeached long before there had been even a phone call made to Ukraine. But, of course, that's the argument being used at the moment. They go on to then point out a few other things. The vote marked the first House floor vote on impeachment since Democrats launched their inquiry last month into Trump's efforts to pressure the Ukraine government. And it followed weeks of closed-door depositions by 3 congressional panels, which resulted in days of negative headlines as witnesses offered damaging testimony. We come back from the break, though, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how to evaluate some of this. I'm not surprised that this vote was taken, although there were many arguing that Nancy Pelosi would not do so, and she did. I think that pressure was coming. I think there will be a lot of pressure and maybe even a vote for impeachment. And then I want to go into the response from House Republicans and the response from Senate Republicans, and just a little bit more on some of the justification for all of that. But we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. So glad to be back from Israel and Rome. A little bit of jet lag. We'll see how that plays out over the next 3 hours, but I'm looking forward to the opportunity to present this. And, of course, if at any point you'd like to join the conversation, of course, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the crime rate is up in many cities, so maybe it's time to consider a solution rarely suggested. Let's see what faith-based organizations and people of faith can do. The evidence is that it can reduce the crime rate and the recidivism rate in our prisons. This is the argument Baylor University criminologist Byron Johnson makes in his book, More God, Less Crime. Sadly, most social scientists and even criminologists seem reluctant to make the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives could have on America's crime problem. Dr. Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message doesn't resonate with most social scientists. Many are even hostile to religion, as demonstrated by the opening chapter in his book entitled The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Dr. Johnson also says that faith-based organizations were merely tolerated within the criminal justice system. In some places, they're seen as valuable and even helpful. In other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. This is unfortunate since the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks and shrinking budgets. Prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, and Kairos Prison Ministry can provide people and programs that can make a difference. Faith-based organizations of all kinds can provide volunteers and educators to help with programs in life skills and adult education. The book is full of positive examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in their local community. He tells the story of the Boston Miracle, where police and pastors worked together to break the stranglehold gangs had in the community. He also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and violence-free zones. He even gives practical advice on the important issues of prisoner reentry and aftercare. Most importantly, he provides a review of the literature so that churches and faith-based organizations can show skeptics that the title of the book is true. More God, Less Crime. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, as I mentioned, we are going to have Jim Denison in studio in less than an hour, and we'll spend some time talking about this issue of impeachment, how we think about this, how we should pray for our president, whether we like the president or not, and what should be kind of our biblical response to some of these issues, including as we talk about the death of the leader of ISIS. Where do we go from here? The defeat of ISIS in some respects is military, but the greatest defeat will take place in the cultural and spiritual realm. So we'll be talking about that with him as well. Let me get into a couple of other issues related to this, because over the last couple of weeks, of course, there have been these hearings which have been secret, and that caused a number of Republicans one time to decide to march down and actually break into the hearing. Wasn't probably the smartest tactic, but it certainly got a lot of attention, and I think that was exactly what was intended. But you also have to, as a watcher of some of this process, bring a little bit of political sophistication. And if there's one thing I try to pass on from time to time here on Point of View, it's how to evaluate with some discernment what's taking place. One of the things I've learned is if you've got lots of really important blockbuster information, you release it all at once, and it just simply overwhelms the news cycle, and thus that becomes kind of the knockout punch. If you don't have a lot of good information, if you're really kind of sketchy about your information, but you want to make an impact, you let it out in dribs and drabs. Now, I have no idea what was happening inside these meetings that were taking place since they're closed. I have no contact with those individuals, and I would imagine that even if we brought Representative Van Taylor on here, he might not know a lot either. I saw a great video the other day with Dan Crenshaw trying to even go in and get some information, some transcripts, and they wouldn't let him have it either. So, again, this is speculative, but it helps you think about how to evaluate how the news cycle goes. And if you've noticed, there have been sort of little small dribs and drabs dropped each day. And I think that if indeed there isn't a lot of not a great deal of damaging information to the president, then the best way to create the greatest impact is to let out a little bit each day. And so that tells me that they don't have just some great silver bullet, smoking gun, whatever metaphor you want to use, and they're just trying to use a lot of innuendo and other kinds of statements. We'll find out soon enough, because now we have the parameters that have been adopted, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But if nothing else, this week, of course, the White House aide testified of his concerns about Trump's July 25th call. I'll talk more about him in just a minute, citing from another article. But the Republicans had argued that Democrats have leaked information to cast testimony on Trump on the worst light. There's no clear evidence of a quid pro quo tying the withholding of military aid to Ukraine to pressure that country to conduct politically motivated investigations. And again, I'm reading a lot from this article in The Hill. But this particular resolution that has now been adopted, again, the vote pretty significant, 232 to 196 along partisan lines, party lines, sets the parameters now, which will establish a process for the House Intelligence Committee to hold now open hearings, release transcripts of closed-door witness testimony, and issue a report. It then sets a path for handling the inquiry over the House Judiciary Committee, which would then be tasked with crafting articles of impeachment and sending them to the floor. Let me just, again, jump in real quickly before I read the rest of this article by saying they took this vote and they all headed home. Yes, another recess. Isn't that amazing here? It's a Halloween night, and everybody's got to get home for November. And, of course, there are some elections, but not very many. And so this is kind of a drive-by vote, and then everybody's off. So it illustrates exactly what I've been saying before. This argument that we'd have any kind of impeachment proceedings before Thanksgiving, I think, is just a pipe dream, but you never know. Maybe the wheels of justice, or in this case, some people think injustice, will grind quicker, but mostly they grind pretty slowly because you have to go to the House Intelligence Committee first. Then you got to go to the House Judiciary Committee. You have to have articles of impeachment. Then that has to go through the Rules Committee and eventually goes to the floor, and then a vote. We'll see. We'll see. But nevertheless, and I think there may be a deliberate attempt to try to slow this down as much as possible so that it has an impact during the primary season when Democrats are trying to elect their particular opponent to Donald Trump, and also at the same time do what they can to harm Donald Trump for the general election. But what about the question that is kind of looming behind all of this? What if President Trump decides not to cooperate? There has some indication that Rudy Giuliani might not cooperate. And so where does that take us? Well, the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler could deny any requests made by the president or his counsel, so we'll see. But the resolution at least now gives Republicans on the Intelligence Committee and on the Judiciary Committee the opportunity to request witness and documents consistent with past inquiries. So, but interesting enough, the Democrats can still block all of this. So it will be interesting to see how open these become. But if you want to get an understanding of how upset some members of Congress are on the Republican side, there was a sign, I just read about it, I haven't seen it yet. It was a poster that was made by the House Minority Whip, that's Steve Scalise. Remember, he was the one that was shot at the baseball practice. But it was a picture that said Soviet-style impeachment proceedings superimposed over the image of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. So we'll see how this plays out, but nevertheless, that has been the vote that took place today. We'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk with Jim Denison. But one of the requests that came from a representative from the state of Texas, Brian Babin, who I've never had on the program, maybe we can get him on sometime, was a letter asking for the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, to actually have a voice vote. This particular, as a matter of fact, his tweet said this. I'll just read the tweet. Instead of an electronic vote on House Democrats' sham impeachment resolution for Donald Trump, we should stand up and announce out loud our votes. I'm a no. In front of our constituents and the nation, I'm leading the effort to ensure that Speaker Pelosi does just that. Well, that wasn't done. But I think it's kind of interesting why he wanted to do that. First of all, mostly you have voice votes in the Senate. There's a reason you only have 100 senators. 435, that's almost 5 times longer for a voice vote. So there's a reason why, with the exception maybe of voting for the Speaker of the House or major resolutions, that's never done. But I think his point is well taken, and that is impeachment is a very grave action indeed. Even the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said that. And so he said in his statement here, instead of quietly casting our votes on the electronic system before leaving town for another recess week, these guys don't work hardly at all. Anyway, we should all stand before our colleagues and the country to answer the question when our name is called one at a time. All 432 of us, a few of them, of course, are not seated, currently in office from Abraham to Zeldin. And I would agree with that. And it, of course, did not happen. But it's just a reminder once again of the fact that this is a very solemn procedure. And it is certainly one that people are taking seriously, which leads me to one of my other articles. And this is also from The Hill, which, again, is the record for the Congressional Hill. And it points out that some of the Republicans in the Senate are taking the House impeachment proceedings more seriously than before, probably leading the way in terms of really expressing some question would be Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina. He was, as they say, the latest Republican senator to express concerns Wednesday, even though he argued that the House has yet to provide any evidence that would support actually removing Trump from office. Recognize that even if you have a vote for the impeachment of the president in the House, that doesn't mean anything other than then that particular case goes to the Senate, and the Senate becomes a huge courtroom in which the Chief Justice of the United States becomes the judge, and the 100 members of the Senate actually become the jury. One senator from West Virginia said that the prospect of a quick vote to dismiss any articles of impeachment probably is unlikely. Another Republican senator who requested anonymity, that'll be interesting, to comment on internal party discussions said that Republican colleagues are taking the possibility of impeachment trial seriously as the Democratic-controlled House compiles more evidence. But nevertheless, let me end with these comments. One from the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which would be Lindsey Graham, says, I think it would be disposed of very quickly. And another coming from Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, also a Republican, saying, why on earth would we give a platform to someone that I judge as a purely political exercise? So there is kind of an internal debate right now as to whether or not once those articles of impeachment, if voted for in the House, would be seriously considered in the Senate. But at least we're hearing some senators say, well, I guess I want to hear the evidence before we decide whether to dismiss or to go ahead on a vote. We'll be back right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention, if you'd like to join us as we talk about impeachment, we're going to be doing more of that in the next hour with Jim Denison. But if you have a comment, 1-800-351-1212, or else just feel free to sit back and listen. If you're going to leave a comment on our Facebook page, we'll look at that in just a minute as well. Not going to spend a whole lot more time talking about impeachment. This is going to wear you out, and I have so many other things we need to be talking about other than this distraction of impeachment. I recognize it's important. It was important to talk about it today, especially since the vote took place in the House of Representatives. And, of course, the final vote is still months away, I suspect. But still, it was worth talking about today. But if you talk about the things that are going to affect your faith, your family, your freedom, whether the president is impeached or not is not going to affect a whole lot. It might affect the economy. I'm going to say some things about that in just a minute. But it really isn't going to affect your daily life very much. And even if the president were removed from office, and that will not happen, there is just no evidence that that will happen, then it's a lot of political show, and it distracts us from very important things, including my commentary today, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you got something to write with, get out a pen, pencil, or just jot it on your tablet or your smartphone. Proverbs 18, verse 17. Proverbs 18, verse 17. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And again, this is the idea that everything seems right until you have a chance to cross-examine. And this is what is going to change dramatically now in this impeachment hearings, because Republicans, unless they're completely boxed out, are going to be able to ask some very important questions. And I mentioned just a minute ago, and this is the last thing we'll talk about impeachment because there's so many other things to cover, but there is kind of the new hero for people that oppose Donald Trump, and his name is Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. First of all, let me say that some people that have criticized his testimony, I don't think they're criticizing him as a military individual. He's a Ukraine expert for the National Security Council and all the rest, but he was one of those individuals who listened to the phone call that the president made with the Ukrainian president. And then he testified before Adam Schiff's court yesterday, which would now be, I guess, Tuesday, since I'm reading this from a day later. And according to the New York Times, I'm just going to give you the quote. He said, quote, "I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine. I realized that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the Bidens and Burisma, it would likely be interpreted as a partisan ploy and would be undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing the bipartisan support it has thus far maintained." First of all, Gary Bauer, a good friend, points out that the president, first of all, did not demand anything, at least in the transcript we have. Now some people are saying, well, there's some gaps in the transcript. Okay, we'll find out. But it doesn't seem like there's anything close to a quid pro quo, because the questions about military aid had everything to do with questions as to whether or not we have a legitimate government there. But again, Gary Bauer then goes on to say, given the fact that Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman had concerns about the phone call, he asked, well, then where was Colonel Vindman's concern when 3 liberal senators threatened Ukraine's bipartisan support if Ukraine officials didn't cooperate with a Mueller investigation? And where was Colonel Vindman's concern when the Ukrainian officials were scrambling to cover up their support of Hillary Clinton? By the way, he's got links, HTML links to every one of those as well. And so he points out that here is an individual that, of course, has been used in this regard for Ukraine, but it's worth mentioning that he is a Ukrainian immigrant, that Ukrainian officials sought his advice on how to deal with Rudy Giuliani, and what exactly does that mean? And if he gives the same kind of testimony in front of both Republicans and Democrats, some of those questions that were not asked in the secret shift hearings are going to be asked. And it brings me back to, again, Proverbs 18:17. You know, what seems right certainly begins to fade under any kind of cross-examination when others come to examine him. And so Proverbs 18:17 is a reminder as to why we so often do have an opportunity for you to cross-examine witnesses. You have, if you've ever served in a jury, and I have served in a number of juries. I've also been eliminated from a lot of juries, as you might imagine, when they figure out who I am. But nevertheless, when you serve on a jury, you recognize when you hear one testimony, you go, oh, that seems good. And then you get the cross-examination, you go, I hadn't thought about that. This person maybe isn't always telling the truth, or, there's contrary evidence. And so this is why we do this in a court of law. And up until now, you've had one side getting a chance to present their view and to selectively leak information to the press. That's going to change rather dramatically. But one last comment about impeachment. We'll move on to some other topics. Lindsey Graham the other day actually said that his estimate is there isn't one vote among Republicans to impeach Trump because he did nothing wrong. Now, he would already be impeached if he came to the Senate, so what he means there is wouldn't be anyone to remove him. And even the USA Today poll finds that most voters reject impeachment and do not believe the president's phone call constitutes an impeachment offense, which is interesting because there are a lot of polls that are being bandied around right now by the Democrats saying, well, a majority of Americans believe that the president should be removed from office. Which polls are you looking at? Because we can certainly point to a USA Today poll, which shows just the opposite. And if nothing else, Gary Bauer kind of gives us a quick 6 points to remember when you are evaluating this. Number one, President Trump placed a call to the newly elected president of Ukraine. Number two, in the call, he raised the question of corruption. Number three, we have a treaty with Ukraine to fight corruption. Guess who signed it? President Bill Clinton. Number four, in the call, Trump mentioned that more aid was coming to Ukraine. Number five, during the call, Trump never demanded an investigation in exchange for the aid. And number six, even if it generally linked the two, it's standard operating procedure to use foreign aid as a leverage. And I thought just for a minute, I'll mention that before we take a break. Just a few weeks ago when I was in studio before I took our trip to Israel and Rome, Dr. Merrill Matthews raised a very good question off air. And I've oftentimes said some of the best conversations take place in here when we don't have the microphones on. But he said, I'm waiting for some of these presidential historians to document some of the cases in which we know that a quid pro quo was used in terms of foreign aid. We know for a fact that under the Clinton administration, pushed largely by that time First Lady Hillary Clinton, that institutions, and in particular various foreign governments that did not have a liberal abortion law, were threatened by losing any kind of foreign aid. We do suspect that probably the same kinds of questions were raised under George W. Bush to get our allies, quote, some of them the more reluctant allies, to join with us in Operation Desert Storm and things like that. And, of course, you've got, no doubt, various kinds of things which also surfaced during the Obama administration. I think it's hard to imagine any president in modern time, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Harry Truman to Dwight Eisenhower, to John F. Kennedy, to Richard Nixon, to Gerald Ford, to Jimmy Cargill, to Ronald Reagan, to certainly probably George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump, where that was not used. And so he was saying, I'm waiting for some of these presidential historians to actually document some of this. And my answer as we go to a break is, you're going to wait a long time. Because I can think of some of these individuals that have been on National Public Radio, but on public broadcasting, have been on some of the History channels, sometimes have joined some of these roundtables for the mainstream media, who have talked about all sorts of things we've learned about these presidents and what happened behind the scenes. You know that not a single one of them now is going to come out and remind us that actually what you are alleging President Trump doing is actually no different than whatever, and you fill in the blank, various other presidents were doing. And certainly some come to mind: Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, certainly John F. Kennedy, no doubt probably a couple of others, Richard Nixon, no doubt, Bill Clinton. I mean, we can go down the list of individuals that probably many times, in order to enact a policy, played hardball. And so here you have people trying to make this an impeachable offense by simply challenging whether or not this was a quid pro quo, when even if it was, and it wasn't, it's certainly standard operating procedure for presidents in the past and probably will be for presidents in the future. Anyway, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about Adam Smith's revenge, because as we now know, the trade war really did hurt the economy, and I thought it might be worth spending just a minute to talk about that, and also give you an update on what is happening with the Elizabeth Warren campaign. She may be the odds-on nominee, but there are many big-dollar Democrat donors not necessarily supportive of her. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Great piece came out yesterday in the Wall Street Journal called Adam Smith's Revenge. And I thought for just a minute, it first of all illustrates something happening right now in the economy, but it's also just a great teaching opportunity. By the way, if you're interested, my book on Christians and economics really attempts to try to give you sort of a short summary of some of the economic issues we talk about so often here on Point of View. If you don't have a copy of it, we'd love to get it to you. And of course, we'll probably even take some of the material from this book eventually and put it in some of the booklets. So again, if you are a donor to Point of View, you'll receive some of that in the mail. Those booklets we make available for your gift on a regular basis of $50 a month. So again, there are just some great ways in which you can receive some of this. But let me just give you a quick update on what we would say in terms of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, interestingly enough, was a professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow, University of Glasgow. Most people think he was an economist. We didn't have an actual department of economics at the time, but he was actually challenging the assumed way in which countries could become wealthy because they had adopted a system known as mercantilism. We won't go into all the details, although I do go to that in the book. And the idea is to have high trade barriers, maybe have colonies, and to collect gold. And Adam Smith says that's all completely wrong. What you want to do is not have high trade barriers. You want to lower those barriers because as each individual is involved in economic transactions, the common good is enhanced. They're led almost by an invisible hand, he says, to achieve an end that was not their own. And so he uses the example the butcher, the baker, and the brewer did not intend for you to benefit, but in order to get you to buy their product, they had to produce a high-quality product at a low price because they're competing for prices. That was the case. And so the argument, whether at the individual level or at the national level, is that trade barriers are a bad idea. Hence the comment that we have from the Wall Street Journal, Adam Smith's revenge. Trade damage takes the economy down to Obama growth levels. They say the great counterfactual, which is saying that what Trump was saying is just the opposite, is how much faster the economy would be growing without the damage of his trade protectionism. Wednesday's report of a lackluster 1.9 growth in the third quarter shows, again, that you can't escape Adam Smith's revenge for indulging in bad economic policy for political goals. By the way, I know a lot of people that even were hurt by these attempts to break the trade imbalance between us and China and to break down some of their tariffs by raising our tariffs. Some people for a while have gone along with that because they recognize that that may be the only way to fight China. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but it did have a cost because, you know, GDP growth, as they say a little bit later in the article, accelerated to 3% for a time a long investment. But then came President Donald Trump's trade interventions. More than the damage from tariffs, business confidence fell amid the uncertainty of what Mr. Trump would do next. I've often said on this program, you heard me say it last time I was on the program here just about 2 weeks ago with Jerry Tuma, that if there's anything the market doesn't like, it's uncertainty. Even bad policies, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, implemented by a President Elizabeth Warren, at least you can work around it. But when everything is uncertain, nobody does anything and no actions are taken. So that is the case, and so it led to slower growth. And then they also take on one other issue. President Trump and some in the White House blame the Federal Reserve in Europe for this slump, but neither explanation, they say, holds up. Europe hasn't grown fast for decades, and its 2017 growth bump was helped by faster U.S. growth. The Fed, in our view, made a mistake in raising rates a quarter point last December, but businesses did not starve for money even before the Fed began cutting rates again this summer. So if nothing else, just one more example of some of the things that we talk about. Maybe I even do another teaching here sometime on the economy and Adam Smith and where those ideas come from, but nevertheless, just a good illustration of something I talk about in my book. The wealth of nations is enhanced when we have low trade barriers, and as a result, each seeking their own self-interest is led almost by an invisible hand to bring about a good and a goal that was not their intention. My commentary today, I might just mention real quickly, More God, Less Crime. Comes from a very good book by Baylor criminologist Byron Johnson, which has that title. And he's pointed out that we are seeing all sorts of evidence that the best way to fight crime, the best way to lower the crime rate, is to have faith-based organizations. And so whether it's prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, Kairos Prison Ministry, whether it's some of the individuals we've had on this program that have even implemented Bible college curriculum, seminary-level curriculum in the prisons, that's where I think you are seeing some of the most significant changes taking place. And it just is, this particular commentary reminds me of all sorts of examples of where when the government tries to do something, because it can't minister to the soul, it can't minister to the psychology of individuals, it can't minister to the hurt, the pain that they have. This is why faith-based organizations always do better. You look at drug rehabilitation. Faith-based groups are much more effective than secular ones. You look at trying to lower the recidivism rate. Again, faith-based organizations much more effective than secular ones. And we shouldn't be surprised. The power of the Holy Spirit and the power of the gospel makes a difference. I haven't said much about the campaign, but I thought it might just be worth mentioning again that Elizabeth Warren at the moment seems to be on a roll. And as our good friend Dr. Merrill Matthews has pointed out, she is doing so well for a couple of different reasons. His article here, Why Warren is Taking the Lead. Number one, she is perhaps one of the most prepared of the candidates. She always says, I got a plan for that. Number two, she's a very engaging and amicable and approachable candidate and stays there for long periods, taking selfies with individuals. Number three, if you would like Bernie Sanders' policies, but you don't like the socialist label, well, you get socialist policies without the socialist label because she's a Democrat, not a socialist, although she basically holds to the socialist ideas. And number four, probably can be considered a minority as a woman, which is always silly because there's a majority of women in the country, but you know what I'm getting at, a victim. And so that brings us to the latest published material. Big dollar Democrat donors threaten mutiny if Warren wins nomination. You don't have to read the entire article to figure it out. When she's proposing everything from a wealth tax to actually forcing equity firms to take on pension obligations, when she wants to actually expand the role of government to oversee everything happening in Wall Street, many of these people make their money in Wall Street, and they're going, she would be a disaster for us. And so even though as Democrats they might like some of her progressive policies, they're now saying that we are headed towards a mutiny of big Democrat donors. And again, let me just hasten to add that a lot of people think that all the big money in Wall Street is Republican. Barack Obama proved that that is just the opposite. A lot of the big money in Wall Street is in the hands of Democrats who in the past have supported people like Barack Obama and certainly would be inclined to support a Joe Biden, but have real hesitations about supporting Elizabeth Warren. So, again, we'll keep watching the campaign, and, of course, there'll be other opportunities to hear from the candidates, and, of course, we'll cover some of that as well. When we come back from the break, though, let me spend some time talking with our good friend in studio, Jim Denison. He is the CEO of Denison Forum. You're going to see some conversation. We'll have a little bit of, we'll mention, of course, it is Halloween, so we'll mention that just briefly because he's written a little bit about that today, and that's posted on that. But mostly we're going to talk about the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. What does that mean for ISIS? How do we defeat ISIS? Some of it can be defeated on the military battlefield, but most of it is going to happen in the cultural and spiritual realm, so we're going to talk about that. And then how do we as Christians think about this issue of impeachment? So we'll spend an hour with him, and then in the next hour, we'll spend a little bit of time talking with our friend Todd Starnes about his new book, Cultural Jihad, How to Stop the Left from Killing a Nation. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Welcome to Point of View, and I am so glad to be back. I certainly have missed being on the program, but as you know, we had our trip to Israel and to Rome, and it was a very long and sometimes a little bit difficult. You've done some international travel. I've got Jim Denison in studio with me. I'll give you a formal introduction in just a minute, but I just wanted to say that I want to thank those that have covered for the program. We ran a few repeats, and now I'm here. I don't know the next time I'm getting on an airplane, so we'll be here for all the broadcast, and I'm looking forward to these next 2 hours because we have, first of all, our good friend Jim Denison in studio with us. Of course, we recognize today is Halloween, so we'll mention that just in passing because there was some very interesting stuff in his today's daily article, but a lot of what we're going to focus on are some of the things that he and his son have written about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and those are part of the daily article. Then we'll get into the issue of impeachment because if you have not heard, we'll mention once again that the vote today, 232 to 196, a party line vote, which again establishes the procedures for an investigation of an impeachment. We'll get more into that in just a minute. And at the same time, got to say congratulations to the Washington Nationals. What is it about this home field advantage? It seems like they always do better in their other ballparks, but I'll leave that maybe for just a minute to Jim Denison, since I believe you're a Houston Astros fan.
Born and raised.
So, again, condolences to you, but congratulations to a team that hasn't won since the Washington Senators back in the 1930s. So nothing else. A lot to cover today. And you do mention that in the daily article. By the way, if you don't receive the daily article, we have a link to that on the website. But this was entitled A Colossal Flaming Jack-O-Lantern in the Sky, and then examining ghosts and living by transforming truth. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about impeachment and the defeat of ISIS. But I thought for just a minute, what about this? It turns out that, as you point out, NASA, as a space agency, actually sees something that kind of looks like a jack-o'-lantern. Explain that.
Well, thank you, Kerby. So glad to be back with you. I'm glad you're back safely. I've been traveling as well, and good to be back in town. Good to be back in Dallas, although we're having winter in Dallas.
Yes, we are.
We had fall for about a day and a half, and now we're into winter, as apparently is how it works in this part of the world. But, yeah, so I wanted to do something relative to Halloween with today's article. And NASA, back a few years ago, took a picture of the sun that was at that particular point experiencing some kind of flares and parts of the sun that makes it look just like a jack-o'-lantern, the largest jack-o'-lantern in the history of the world. And so that kind of a picture gave me a chance to talk a little about the popularity of Halloween in our culture today, and then to step over from that to the popularity of ghosts, that 45% of Americans believe in the existence of ghosts. 43% believe that ghosts are the spirits of deceased people come back and visit them or haunt them, but they're doing that based on personal experience, certainly not based on any kind of scientific data or information. And that gave me a chance to talk about, as you know, the idea that truth is what I say it is.
Yes.
And that's the larger issue that transcends Halloween.
Well, again, some of those numbers were shocking to me because I've always recognized that there are a fair number of people that believe in the supernatural. A lot of people believe in reincarnation. A lot of people believe in spirit guides and all that. But when you say 45% of Americans believe ghosts exist, 43% think ghosts can come back to haunt people or places, it brings us back to, Halloween and some of the things done by Wiccan groups and satanic groups and a variety of others. And not all of them claim to even agree with everything that happens on Halloween. So I'm not trying to cast with a broad brush, but it is amazing to me that you also found that a third of Americans say they have personally felt the presence of a spirit or a ghost. 13% say they have communicated directly with a ghost or a spirit of someone who has died. a former first lady even claimed that, I guess. That this is something that maybe needs to be addressed. You're a former pastor. You really minister to pastors. This might be something to think about, to address from the pulpit. What's your thoughts?
I think it is. There's obviously an issue here, and this transcends Hollywood specifically. As you mentioned before, the Wiccans and other groups don't see Halloween as anything but one expression of what they're going to do all year.
Yes.
This isn't something they're just doing on this particular day of the year, of course. So it makes it a transcendent issue. If people believe that my experience equals truth, then that transcends even the paranormal. That goes to sexual morality. That goes to gender identity. That really goes to all of the issues from abortion to euthanasia that we're dealing with today. Truth is personal, individual, and subjective. Well, one of the things that's interesting, I found this fascinating in some of the research that I was able to quote. Psychology professor Christopher French. Studies show that if people are told a location is haunted, they report more anomalous experiencers.
Yes.
Senses of presence, shivers down the spine, that sort of thing. Believers in the paranormal are more susceptible to such suggestions than skeptics, which says to us again that if I expect a particular experience to happen, I'm much more likely to have that experience. If I can get to the day that I'll examine my experience through Scripture rather than Scripture through experience, that's the place to try to go.
And again, this gets back to this key word I say all the time, discernment, because you even mentioned one of these articles on your website, Is Anyone Telling the Truth in Today's News? Might just mention that not only are we privileged to have Jim Denison in studio, but next hour we'll have for a little while Todd Starnes as we talk about his book, Cultural Jihad. And again, one of the things he's tried to do is just cut through some of the political correct chatter out there, talk about stories that nobody else in the mainstream media is covering, and so we'll be talking about that with him.
Terrific. There's a secularization thesis, as you know as well as anybody in the country, Kirby, this idea that the culture is inevitably becoming more and more secular. We got that back to Sigmund Freud and to Max Weber and to whole Karl Marx, for instance. So when I decide that that's the case, that the culture inevitably has to follow Europe, that we have to become as secular as Europe does, well, then that's the lens through which I not only decide how to interpret events, but either what events I'll interpret, what stories even make the news. And if something's contrary to that, you won't read about it in the press. You won't see it in the media, which is why people like Todd Starnes and others are doing us such a great favor in showing us the things that really in many ways violate the secularization thesis, and they're stories that we need to be hearing so that we can interpret culture more effectively.
And that's what we try to do here at Point of View, and that's what you try to do through the daily article. Let me mention again, if you're not familiar with Jim Denison, of course, he's the CEO of Denison Forum. We're going to be talking about, of course, the daily articles, but we also have his 7 critical issues, which we'll talk about in just a minute, which we'll be quoting as we talk about Islam. Matter of fact, of course, the first time you and I ever did an interview, we were talking about your book on Islam. Have others that have to do with everything from the Sermon on the Mount to what is happening in our culture, including one that you and your son, Ryan Denison, co-authored. And so when we come back from the break, I thought we would move away from this to that issue of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I think a lot of people want to know, well, where do we go from here? What happens to ISIS and those kinds of things? But to end on a positive note, this is a dark day, Halloween, but it is followed by All Saints' Day and Reformation Day. So if you're looking for a positive spin, it happens tomorrow, right?
That's right.
Yes.
Exactly so. That's how God works, isn't it? From the bad comes the good. From the dark comes the light. And God's in charge of all of that. He's on his throne. He hasn't left his throne. Nothing we read today surprises him. He sees tomorrow better than we see today, and that gives us hope that no matter what we feel about the future, we know the one that holds the future.
Yes. Well, again, Halloween or October 31st, if you would like to read that in the daily article, we're going to give it that much more comment because we're going to move on to ISIS and the bigger issue, because we saw what happened especially at Al-Qaeda after the killing of Osama bin Laden, even before that when he was on the run, how they sort of franchised the movement. But we're going to talk about 4 steps to defeating ISIS. One of those is on the battlefield, but the other 3 really happen in the cultural and spiritual areas. And so we're going to learn from Dr. Jim Denison. And if you have a comment or question, I've been able to coerce him to be on for an entire hour. So that means if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Oftentimes he can only be with us for half an hour, but he will be with us this entire hour. So if you'd like to join us as we come back and talk about ISIS and Islam, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Jim Denison, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the crime rate is up in many cities, so maybe it's time to consider a solution rarely suggested. Let's see what faith-based organizations and people of faith can do. The evidence is that it can reduce the crime rate and the recidivism rate in our prisons. This is the argument Baylor University criminologist Byron Johnson makes in his book, More God, Less Crime. Sadly, most social scientists and even criminologists seem reluctant to make the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives could have on America's crime problem. Dr. Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message doesn't resonate with most social scientists. Many are even hostile to religion, as demonstrated by the opening chapter in his book entitled The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Dr. Johnson also says that faith-based organizations were merely tolerated within the criminal justice system. In some places, they're seen as valuable and even helpful. In other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. This is unfortunate since the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks and shrinking budgets. Prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, and Kairos Prison Ministry can provide people and programs that can make a difference. Faith-based organizations of all kinds can provide volunteers and educators to help with programs in life skills and adult education. The book is full of positive examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in their local community. He tells the story of the Boston Miracle, where police and pastors worked together to break the stranglehold gangs had in the community. He also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and Violence-Free Zones. He even gives practical advice on the important issues of prisoner reentry and aftercare. Most importantly, he provides a review of the literature so that churches and faith-based organizations can show skeptics that the title of the book is true. More God, Less Crime. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. While I was in Israel, we, of course, heard about the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Of course, there are all sorts of back and forth about the dog and whether or not he got a Medal of Honor and all that kind of stuff. I won't even go there. That's just crazy stuff that's happening with the New York Times. But Jim Denison, you have an article on the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, 4 Steps to Defeating ISIS. And then another one, which I appreciate as well, which I knew that they had called this a particular military action, a Kyla Mueller event, but I didn't know all the stories. So we've got quite a bit to cover. And let's first of all just talk about the fact that even though Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was kind of referred to as a theologian or as a student or all the rest, this is an individual that is very evil and was the head of the caliphate that he established of ISIS. But you actually take us back to where he was born and how he changed his name. Tell us a little bit more, if you mind.
Yeah, you bet. Happy to do that. As you would know, the Islamic State itself was something that came along later in the jihadist movement that you could trace back in American terms, even back to the 1970s, and what happened in Iran and all this moved forward from there, and Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda had a chapter in Iraq, and eventually he became in charge of that, and then moved that eventually to the Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL, different acronyms. He himself was born in a place called Samara, and his original last name was al-Samara, or from Samara. It was Awad Ibrahim Ali al-Samara. He received undergraduate, master's, and PhD degrees from the Islamic University in Baghdad, and that's why some have considered him a scholar, although there's some real question as to the validity of the degrees that he experienced and all of that. He changed his last name to al-Baghdadi and took for his first name Abu Bakr, which was the Prophet Muhammad's father-in-law and his successor, claiming to be a direct descendant of Muhammad. What made him so different from even Osama bin Laden and other leaders over the years was his claim to be the caliph that reestablished the caliphate. And so, as you know, back after Muhammad died in 632, the next 4 successors were known as caliphs. That's the Arabic word for successor. And the area that they governed from, the geography, was known as the Caliphate. Well, that Caliphate was destroyed by Turkey in 1924, after the end of World War I. When this particular individual shows up and claims that he's reconstituted the Caliphate, that struck a chord emotionally and theologically with thousands of jihadists around the world. They gave credibility to his movement, credibility to him. It gave in their mind the idea that he was this figure that was by Allah sent to rebuild the caliphate so that the Mahdi could come back, which is their Messiah, and then Islam would conquer the world, essentially. And so the destruction of the caliphate and eventually the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi becomes very important in defeating that rhetoric, as you know.
Well, and I think it's important to recognize that he also saw the significance of date. A lot of people say, why 9/11 for Osama bin Laden? He made one of his announcements on July 4th from the mosque in Mosul, which is the ancient city of Nineveh. So there is always this kind of symbolic idea that is being presented. But he is gone. But that brings us to one of the most powerful pieces. And I've posted this on the website because I want people to read this, because in your book on the state of our nation, 7 critical issues, and I've got a copy right there on our table, you talk about 4 steps to defeat ISIS. And the problem that our friends in the Pentagon and even in the State Department make is that you aren't just going to defeat ISIS on the battlefield. Right. Military action is important. And again, a shout out and an appreciation to all of our listeners in the military. Absolutely. But the bottom line is a fairly significant amount of the success, as you point out, is going to happen in the cultural and spiritual areas, isn't it?
Absolutely. As you know, they've created an organization that's not like Nazis under Hitler, where if we could somehow get to Hitler or capture him or kill Hitler, we could in essence defeat the Nazi movement because it was so much his own personality, his own leadership. Not the case here. In fact, this morning they've already announced the successor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and it was expected that would be the case, just as Osama bin Laden was succeeded by Ammar al-Zawahiri, and that's going to continue to be the case. There's an ideology behind all of this that really is the thing Americans need to understand better than we do. The Muslim jihadists have this idea that the West has been attacking Islam since the Crusades, and especially by supporting Israel. Well, as you know, Surah 2, verse 190 requires Muslims to defend Islam. So they believe they have to attack us to defend Islam. Further, they believe that because ordinary citizens, we would say, support the military and our government with our taxes and our votes, attacking us, you and me individually, is a defense of Islam required by the Quran. Well, that's an ideology that transcends Iraq and Syria. That transcends ISIS or al-Baghdadi. That's something that we're fighting right now on a global front. That's ultimately a spiritual conflict for which we are on the front lines.
To pick up just for a second, maybe a slight rabbit trail, but it does seem to me that that's one of the reasons why so many Muslims have become Christians. The arguments that are being made, and I think that they're pretty well based, more Muslims have become Christians in the last few decades than in the previous centuries before. And part of that is a sense of, is that what I really believe, that we're going to blow up people with suicide vests and we're going to follow these radical individuals that want to implement Sharia law? And so in some respects, this has also been kind of a great evangelistic opportunity, hasn't it?
It truly has. As you know, the radical Muslims have been much more a threat to moderate Muslims than they have even to us. 90% of the people killed under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi were themselves Muslim.
Yes.
They just weren't his kind of Muslim.
Yeah.
And they're looking at him and his movement, and if that's authentic Islam, and that's what he claimed it to be, he claimed he was reestablishing the original caliphate and all of that. If that's true Islam, I don't want that, is what they're deciding. And then their visions and dreams by which Muslims are having incredible transformational experiences with the Holy Spirit. And good friends of mine that serve in the Middle East would say what you just said, that more Muslims have come to Christ in the last 15 years than the previous 15 centuries. It's a remarkable movement of the Holy Spirit. In fact, a good friend of mine that serves in the Middle East says that radical Islam is Satan's response to the spiritual awakening happening in the Muslim world.
Yes.
That as God is moving there, Satan wants us to fear Muslims rather than pray for them. He wants us to hate them rather than love them. If we won't take that cue, if we'll take every story about al-Baghdadi or anything we see in the news as God's invitation to pray for Muslims, to pray for the next leader of ISIS to come to Christ. You might say, well, that could never happen. Well, think about the Apostle Paul.
Yes.
Think about the difference one person's conversion made. And now imagine this new leader of ISIS coming to faith in Christ, having an experience with Jesus. That's what we ought to be praying for, working for, and being on the front lines toward.
If somebody says, I've got this Muslim friend, been working with them, or they're down the street and I'd like to meet them, is there something at the Denison Forum that would help them build a bridge? Because I know your book does that, but I know you have some other resources, don't you?
We do. Thank you for that. I have some articles on our website. If a person would go to denisonforum.org and just Google Muslims or reaching Muslims, they'll see a variety of articles there that describe ways in which we can do this more effectively. Some starting points. For instance, if I'm speaking to a Muslim friend, you always want to start with common ground, just as Jesus did in John 4 with the woman at the well. So my Muslim friends believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, ascended to heaven, and will return at the end of history. I believe all of that as well. So my question of them is, if Jesus is all of that, but only a man, how is that possible?
That's a good question.
And once we begin to have that conversation inside their own theology, we can perhaps move to the place where we can say, in order for Jesus to be who you believe him to be, he cannot just be a man. He must, in fact, be God. Yeah. And that's the turn that we want to lead people toward. Well, there's some advice around all of that inside those articles.
Well, and again, I think it's just very helpful because they do believe that he was born of a virgin. He was the Messiah, not the definition that we use. Right. And most importantly, that he knew the way to heaven and that he was sinless. Well, there's a place in the Quran, not that you and I read it for our daily quiet time, but we have read in there where even there's a point where Allah tells Muhammad to actually confess his sins. So you have this sinless prophet who is a Messiah who actually was born of a virgin and knows the way to heaven. That, if nothing else, would cause curiosity that they might want to read the Bible. But then you can even point in their Quran where actually Muhammad tells them to read the four books.
That's right.
That'd be the Old and New Testament.
That would be that's exactly
so
right.
I give them Gospel of Luke or John or whatever you might want to do, and that's just another great opportunity.
And we're praying for God to give us those opportunities, and he will.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Let's take a break. When we come back, I see some of you want to ask a question or two, and also we want to help you understand about the significance of the martyrdom of Caleb Mueller, because this was something that was used by the military to identify this action. And then, of course, we have this impeachment taking place, so we got some conversations there as well. So these are the kind of great resources you can find, certainly at the Denison Forum, and these are all what are called daily articles. And if you think that's all that's there, no, there's much more. There are various Bible reading plans, various books, articles, and other resources that are available to you, a podcast, and so all of it is available at our website, pointofview.net, or you can simply go to Denison Forum, which is very simple, and it's just denisonforum.org. And we have links to that in case you happen to be traveling and don't have a chance to write it down. It's all available. And one of the things I want to talk about before we're done is your wife's new book, which I think is really fun, The Songs That Tell the Story. And we, over the years, have done the theology of Christmas hymns and carols, but she's actually put together some great material. And very smart. You have 2 Spotify playlists so that you can listen to those as well. So this is very well done, and just one more great resource from the Denison Forum. When we come back, we'll take some phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. And if you'd like to join the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the Denison Forum, simply go to our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Jim Denison. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Pleased to have in studio with us the CEO of Denison Forum. That's Dr. Jim Denison. And I might just mention that his wife, Janet Denison, has written this devotional book. I'm going to get my copy, The Songs Tell the Story, from traditional songs like Silent Night all the way up to modern classics like Mary Did You Know. One short chapter each day starting December 1st that you'll finish on Christmas Day. And they've also created 2 Spotify playlists to accompany your reading, one for traditional covers of each song and one for modern renditions. And this is just one more great resource from Denison Forum. And Jim Denison, you and I both have a lot in common, one of which is we both outkicked our coverage, didn't we?
People have accused me of that over the years, and they are exactly right.
Yes,
I think I'm pretty smart
to
have married someone so much smarter than myself. I thought that was wise of me.
I would like to see if we can get her in studio or even by phone for a few minutes to talk about this, because as we get to the Christmas season, of course, we've done some things on the theology of Christmas carols, and she and I could probably have a pretty good conversation about that. But let's take some phone calls. We're talking about Islam, and we'll head to the state of Tennessee first. Murph, you're on with Dr. Jim Denison.
Yes, sir. Thanks for taking this call. I enjoyed your conversation about this terrorist that was killed. But at the same time, the Quran demands, I believe it's in Surah 8 and 9, to destroy any infidel, period, without question. And I was just like to get your thoughts on how does that stand with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for these, quote, end quote, moderate Muslims that live here in America? Because if the call comes from Mecca or Medina or Baghdad for them to have holy jihad, they've got to do one or the other. It's either the Constitution or the Quran. Thank you very much.
Yes, and I might just mention one of my booklets is on Sharia law, and I oftentimes argue that one of the ways to argue against it is, of course, it would violate the Constitution 1, 8, and 14, First Amendment, 8th Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment, 14th Amendment on equal protection. But Merce raised a bigger question, because let's take the Surah of the Sword, Surah 9:5. Mm-hmm. If you say that that is a command that applies to this day, those are dangerous people, and you want to alert Homeland Security or the Defense Department. But if they contextualize that and say that was for the past, those are the moderate Muslims. Talk about that.
That's exactly right. And I'm grateful to Murph for calling in from Tennessee, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, I was in Tennessee last week. It is a beautiful state. They have 4 seasons, unlike Dallas, where we have fall for about a day and a half, I'm afraid. So the question that Murph is asking is, of course, one of the foundational questions as regards how we can understand Islam in America today. And we talk about radical Muslims and moderate Muslims, and what is it that we have in mind here? Well, as you know so well, Kerby, the Quran was revealed, as it were, to Muhammad over a series of time, over a series of years. He receives his first revelation around 610 AD. He's living in Mecca at the time, and for the next 12 years, about half of the Quran is so-called revealed to Muhammad at that point in time, and it's very conciliatory. In these verses, you find things like, to you be your way and to me be mine, and let there be no compulsion in religion. And then he makes this flight to Medina around 622, and from 622 to 632, he's in Medina. That part of the Quran is very combative.
Yes.
Those are the verses like the sword verses, like Surah 9, verse 5, that Murph mentioned before, where Muslims are commanded to kill infidels. And so the question is, which interprets which? To the radical jihadist, the later the revelation, the more authoritative. It's called the doctrine of abrogation. And so these late verses, like these sword verses, are more authoritative than the earlier verses that require moderation and toleration. To the moderate Muslim, it's just the opposite. They would see these sword verses as necessary to establish Islam, to establish the Ummah, the global Muslim community, back in the 7th century, but they don't apply as law today. They would interpret that through the verses in Mecca that are more conciliatory, more tolerant. So it has to do with which interprets which. In a biblical context, by way of analogy, it's kind of like the doctrine or the command to kill the Canaanites. We look at that as necessary at that point in time to establish Israel, but I don't know of any biblical Christian who believes they're required to find and kill Canaanites today. We interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. Well, in their context, for the radical jihadist, it's just the opposite, and that's the major difference in the two.
And again, if people would like to know more, they can go to denisonforum.org and find that. Your book, I might mention that my book as well, dealing with Islam and terrorism, and that's in English, and there's one in Spanish, because we're finding a lot of people would like to be able to present that, deal with those kinds of issues as well. But again, a lot of it has to do with the contextualization, because sometimes they'll say, like, that was important in Muhammad's day, but it's not today. The sad reality, which I point out in the book, is that if indeed a caliphate were ever established, some of those moderate Muslims would probably just go along because, as you point out, and I've said many times, even when I was in Israel, I talked about the greatest threat to a Muslim today is another Muslim.
That's right.
And so that's something to think about. Let's take one more phone call, and then we'll get into a couple of other issues that are part of the daily article. Wayne in Arizona, KNLB. What's your question for us today?
Yes, I have a comment. It is my own opinion. I have been hearing about this Baghdadi guy for 2 or 3 days, and I was thinking that maybe we ought to be a little bit on the careful side about talking about it. Of course, talk about it, but maybe be on the careful side of it because of the fact that we might accidentally wind up advertising for the enemy.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the questions we've always had is, how much do we talk about false theology? How much do we talk about terrorists? Especially when you have some of these shooters, we don't even, as a policy, even mention the names of those individuals. Yeah. And so, that's always a judgment call. What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it really is. Thank you, Wayne, for that, because on the one side, you don't want to be used by the enemy to advance his agenda. On the other side, we're supposed to be equipping the saints for the work of the ministry, and it's hard to equip people for issues that they don't know exist.
Right.
So there's really a balance. I don't know a single principle that applies to every issue. I think, first of all, you pray, obviously, for the discernment of the Holy Spirit. Ask for his leadership and direction. And then typically, as a principle, at least in my deciding what to write on a daily basis or what to speak about in interviews, that sort of thing, I ask myself, is this an issue that affects Christians on such a level that they need to know about it?
They need to know, yeah.
Not just something they might like to know, but do they need to know? And if they need to know about it, then I feel like I'm doing God's work in equipping them to respond to that. And it's a difference between wanting to and needing to. And it's a judgment call on occasion. But in this particular case, when we're talking about the growth of Islam around the world, I think that's something Christians do need to know and be able to respond to.
And again, I think your daily article is, again, you are such good at providing biblical balance to these perspectives and really helping us understand that it goes far beyond this individual, but actually to recognize that we need to be able to challenge the dominant worldview of the Middle East, which is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. And it does seem to me that we should really equip the saints to doing so. And one other point, since we mentioned this one about the military campaign, it was interesting that they actually named it for a martyr. Her name is Kayla Mueller, and you have written about that as well. Tell us more.
That's a remarkable story, it truly is. Kayla Mueller was herself an unusual young lady. As I discovered in kind of getting to know her backstory, learning about her, she grew up in Arizona, attended Northern Arizona University, graduated in 2.5 years with a degree in political science. You and she would have gotten along well, I think, Kerby. In 2012, she traveled to the Turkey-Syria border to provide aid to Syrian refugees. She'd already been volunteering on a variety of levels for a number of years. She'd received awards, even in high school, for her volunteerism. So she came to this border, Turkey-Syria border, to try to help the Syrian refugees. She was very concerned about what she was seeing there. On August 3rd, 2013, she and a friend visited a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Aleppo, Syria, to repair the hospital's internet connection. She and this friend were reportedly taken captive the next day.
Yes.
Ultimately, she was martyred. She was killed by ISIS. She was raped and tortured by al-Baghdadi himself numerous times. And the hostages that knew her story and came out of it came back and gave us the other side of her story that's just remarkable. She refused to give up her faith, even when she was confronting Jihad John, as he was known, that horrible murderer that killed 10 people himself, beheaded them, and confronted her. She refused to back down from her faith. There was a group of teenagers that found a way to escape and wanted her to go with them. She refused to do so because she was afraid if she went with them, they'd be more likely to be caught because the authorities would be looking for her as an American, and she would jeopardize them. So she stayed behind in order for these teenagers to be able to escape. Other hostages talked about the encouragement she gave them, the ministry that she offered them, and all the ways that she continued to serve the Lord. And so to name the campaign that led to the death of al-Baghdadi for her is not just ironic, it's in some ways biblical. It shows us that at the end of the day, good wins, and ultimately God wins. A good friend of mine said he could summarize the book of Revelation in 2 words: we win.
We win.
And Kayla Mueller's an example of that.
So again, that's another one of the daily articles that you can find. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about impeachment for just a few minutes. And again, you have some great insight there. Very apropos, because again, the vote taking place today, 232 to 196. No surprise, 231 Democrats voted for it, only 2 against it. Those would be representatives from Minnesota and New Jersey. And then you had no Republicans voting for it. A former Republican, Justin Amash from Michigan, is now an independent. So the 231 Democrats, one independent, 232 to 196. 4 did not vote. And we'll come back and talk about how do we think through this issue. Impeachment is on the table. We'll be hearing about it. And how do we think about it biblically? There are some very great insights from Jim Denison that we'll get right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and Jim Denison will be with us. And then as we go into the next hour, I'll have some more things to say about impeachment and also take your phone calls. But we are changing topics because I wanted you to hear some of his insight. And let's recognize that, first of all, this has been going on for some time. I've held this up more than once, but this came out a couple months ago. 86 things Democrats have said Trump should be impeached for, starting in February 1st of 2017. So long before anybody even knew there was a phone call to Ukraine, you have about 86 of these 89 that had something else to do. I'm going to talk about how the House has responded, how the Senate Republicans are responding at the moment, and even some of the testimony in front of Adam Schiff's conference, and also what this might mean in terms of the regulations. We're going to push those off to the next hour. And instead, Jim Denison, what do we talk about in terms of impeachment? We know that we should be in prayer for those in authority, 1 Timothy 2. We know that we should obey those in authority, Romans 13. But work that out a little bit more on some of the biblical imperatives on impeachment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kerby, and thank you for wanting to go there, of course. That is so much your heart. So as folks would understand in this conversation, there's really a two-stage process. To impeach the president is to make the decision on the part of the House that the Senate should then take a trial as to whether he should be removed. Impeaching and removing are not the same thing. Even if the House votes to impeach, probably on party lines, doesn't mean he's removed from office at all. Then their charges would be brought to the Senate, and the Senate would have a trial. And the Senate would have to vote as to whether or not the president would actually be removed from office. And in essence, overturning the popular vote, overturning the vote of the American public. So behind all of that, there are all sorts of political issues, as you've described. There are all sorts of things that have been in the market or in the water for a long time. But they're really two biblical imperatives. Whatever our position is on this, whether we're Democrat, Republican, Independent, whether we're supporters of the president or opposed to his administration, we are required by Scripture to understand that there's a difference between the person and the position. If Paul could ask his followers to support the government when the government's led by Nero, when Peter could ask people to pray for the leader when the leader is Nero, the very person who had Peter crucified upside down and Paul beheaded, then we understand that we are required to pray for, support, encourage the position, and do all that we can to understand and support the office that is to be respected in this conversation. But at the same time we do this, we understand our highest authority is the king, not the president. Our highest authority is Jesus himself. And he is King of Kings and he is Lord of Lords, and no Roman emperor, no congressional committee, no House of Representatives, none of that is as authoritative as he is. So the ultimate question is, you're having these conversations with friends, family members, whomever, am I glorifying Jesus by the way I'm doing this? Am I saying this in a way that's slanderous? Am I speaking about this in a way that's dishonoring to the Lord? Am I hurting my witness? Am I advancing my witness? The question isn't whether or not I can win a vote. The question is, can God use me to win souls? The souls are eternal. Whatever happens with the impeachment process, what matters most are the eternal souls of the people we influence. So let's guard our witness. Let's speak the truth in love. Let's do this in a gracious way. Let's respect the position. Let's pray for the person. And let's trust that God will be glorified in and through it all.
And you make a distinction, which I think is very biblical, between the position and the person, and used a New Testament example. How about an Old Testament one? I know that you've been to En-Gedi and preached, and here you have a situation in which basically David had the opportunity to finish off Saul, who was trying to kill him. If you've ever had a justification for finishing off the king, it would be that, but instead cuts off just part of his robe and illustrates again that I could have taken your life, but I did not. And I can't respect some of the actions that you've taken, but I can respect the office. So whether it's the Old Testament, New Testament, that distinction between Old Testament, New Testament, the distinction between the position and the person are really key. And I'm very disturbed about the fact that we have people today that disrespect everything. They disrespect the political offices. They disrespect the church. They disrespect their parents. That's just going to lead to anarchy, isn't it?
It's exactly where that says. One of the reasons I'm so grateful for David's example, so glad you brought that up, he was wanting not only to illustrate this is how he respected the position that Saul occupied, that same respect would then be given to David when he occupied that position.
Very good.
So if right now we're wanting to be supportive of the president or opposing the president, someday the other party's going to be in charge. And then we're going to see the other shoe, as they'd say, on the other foot. And then we're going to hope that we would respond as well on that side, or others would respond as well as we are on this side. Just understand there's a bigger story at work here. And ultimately what matters is that we're glorifying God in how we're speaking, and we're doing it in a way that would lead people closer to him rather than pushing people further away from him. We live in this postmodern culture that says all truth is personal, individual, and subjective. So all authority is an imposed will to power. Goes back to Friedrich Nietzsche and this idea that if you're an authority, you misused your power to get there, and I've got to undermine that position. Well, I'm expressing power by saying that.
Yes.
If I say there's no such thing as truth, I'm making a truth claim. And so ultimately we lead to anarchy if there can be no such thing as authority. I'm claiming authority over you. You're pushing back with authority against me. And ultimately we get to the position where our democratic experiment is in jeopardy.
Yes.
I'm afraid that's the direction we're moving as a culture. That's why I pray every day for spiritual awakening. I pray for a movement of culture-changing Christians who will be truth, speak the truth in love, and be salt and light in this culture.
And really, that's the vision of the Denison Forum. I've been to some of your events, and I know that you really want to have a greater influence. And one of the ways that people can be a receiving party of that influence is to subscribe to the daily article. Well, let's talk about some of the books, because Blessed is one of the books that you have coming out and has come out and really addresses the issue of the Beatitudes. We also mentioned 7 critical issues. If you want a daily devotional guide or you want devotions through your Christmas carols, they're just a lot of great resources. So when people go to denisonforum.org, what will they find when they land on the website?
Thanks so much, my friend. Our ultimate mission is to help to catalyze a movement of culture-changing Christians who will use their influence to make a difference for the kingdom. We believe culture changes top-down. I've been influenced by James Davison Hunter and other sociologists who demonstrate that you get to the highest level of excellence, you live there faithfully, and God will use your salt and light in a way you may be able to measure and may not be able to measure. So what we're trying to do is exactly what you're trying to do, and that is to equip Christians to use their influence more effectively in the culture. And we do it through various brands. The Denison Forum brand that I lead speaks specifically to cultural issues. I write the daily article, goes out each morning by 6 o'clock. There's a podcast version of it as well. Anyone listening to us can find that at denisonforum.org. Have about 180,000 people that receive the article every morning. Have more than 800,000 people in our audience when we put together all of our social media that goes with that. I record 2 videos a day and 3 tweets a day that focus specifically on cultural issues as well. Then we have books and other material. Then First 15 is our devotional resource, first15.org. Anyone listening to us can go to that and find a daily remarkable experience with God. It starts with a worship video, then it goes to a devotional and a guided prayer time. Christian Parenting intends as a third brand to equip parents to raise the next generation to follow the Lord. And then my wife has her own Bible study ministry, janetdenison.org. And those 4 brands together comprise Denison Ministries. If an individual goes to denisonministries.org, they'll see all 4 of those.
Right. And again, you'll find that new book, The Songs That Tell the Story. We'll see if we can get Janet in here as well. Maybe have the 2 of you. That'd be kind of fun to have some stories back and forth. But let me just mention that we do have a link to Jim Denison. And when we come back from the break, we are going to spend some time continuing our conversation about impeachment. I see some of you have some comments about everything from Iran to Daniel's commitment to God. So we'll get into all sorts of issues that relate to how we respect those in authority and how we address some of these issues. But Jim Denison is going to leave us. But let me just again encourage you to go to the denisonforum.org, find some of those articles, some of those great resources, some of the podcasts, and if nothing else, a good illustration when you talked about all things you did. You're not looking for things to do, but you have been nice enough to spend an hour with us today. So thank you so very much.
Kerby, so grateful for you. I've been your biggest fan for years. I'm just so grateful for what you do and the spirit in which you do it. I have told you on occasion that when you get to heaven, you won't have a voice because God's going to give your voice to me. Mm-hmm. I'm convinced of that. But so grateful for your gifting and your mind and your heart, and just so glad to be your friend.
We will spend some time in the next half hour talking about the vote, 232 to 196 on the rules for impeachment. And then we'll spend some time talking with our friend Todd Starnes about culture jihad, which is how to stop the left from killing a nation. So this theme today has been on culture. We've heard from Dr. Jim Denison. A little bit later, we'll hear from Todd Starnes. When we come back, we'll hear from you as we'll take some of those phone calls. We'll be back right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do. in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've got a number of phone calls left over from the last hour, and I'll certainly be glad to address those, but just wanted to, as a program note, mention at the bottom of the hour, we will be talking with Todd Starnes about his new book, Cultural Jihad, How to Stop the Left from Killing a Nation. And again, 18 chapters, about 280 pages. No way we'll cover all of that in the half an hour that we'll have left. But it does kind of come down to a couple of themes that maybe we'll look at. One is the issue of religious liberty, which we'll be talking about tomorrow with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter on our weekend edition. Also on the whole issue of gender issues and then politically correct ideas. So we'll try to pick out a couple of topics that are sort of themes through a book that, of course, covers much more. And I think you'll appreciate that conversation as well. We'll be looking, of course, this hour, if we have some time, on the impeachment. If not, we'll get into more of it tomorrow. By a vote of 232 to 196, party line vote, essentially, which now establishes the process for the House Intelligence Committee to hold open hearings, release transcripts from some of those closed-door witness testimony, and issue a report, which then would be handed over to the House Judiciary Committee, which would then try to craft articles of impeachment, send them to the floor, would go to the Rules Committee, Calendar Committee, and eventually maybe a vote. We'll see whether all this happens within the rest of this year or not. Of course, tomorrow is the 1st of November. And, oh, by the way, Congress is in recess once again. Don't you wish you had that kind of work schedule? So I don't know how they're going to get much done when they took this quick vote and then went out of town. So anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. But we've got a few calls left over from the last hour, and I want to give you a chance to join the conversation. Adam in California, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Oh.
I guess Adam is not on the air. Let's go to Kay in Missouri. KNEO, what would you like to say?
Well, I was listening to the man talking, and he's right, and we need to be civil to one another. But we also have a responsibility in this, we live in a democratic republic. And when you have people in your district that are in Congress, and you're a Christian, and they're not giving this, we have rules that we live by. And if they're not going to use the rules equally across the board, whether it's somebody you like or don't like, you should be calling, this is how I feel anyway, this is part of my duty. I call my congressman and say, it's fine with me, do the impeachment if you want to, but do it where everybody gets a fair, this is our democratic right to have a fair hearing. And I don't care if you're the president or if you're a congressman, you have that right. And I have that right. I only expect the same. But as a Christian, I have a responsibility to talk to my congressman and tell them that I'm not happy with them doing things like this behind closed doors. And I appreciate the two Democrats that went ahead and voted against this, because I don't see this. I was alive for the first two. I've watched them both. And I think the one that was handled actually the best was actually Nixon's, in my opinion. And I think they did it according to the law.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. First of all, for those of you listening, I would encourage you to get something to write with and put down Proverbs 18, verse 17. Because Proverbs 18, verse 17 says that a testimony of a man seems right until another comes and examines him. And I think what you are pointing out here, Kay, is very concerning because some of this has been leaked testimony from secret hearings. Now, you saw a stunt that was used last week in which a number of Republicans then tried to go into those blocked hearings. And, of course, I think it was more of a stunt, but it was trying to call attention to the fact that, yes, these all can sound very logical. Matter of fact, one of the individuals that is kind of the hero right now for those that oppose Donald Trump is Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. And, of course, his testimony was leaked to the New York Times, in which he expressed concern about whether it was proper to demand a foreign government investigate U.S. citizen. And, of course, you can raise the question, of course, whether or not the transcript really shows that. But more importantly, he's a Ukraine official and an individual that was certainly tasked at one point to trying to deal with Rudy Giuliani and a number of other things. So when he's in there and he's seen as a favorable witness and the only people there are Democrats and Adam Schiff, well, that all sounds really good. Now, if he has to give his testimony in front of an open committee and there is going to be an opportunity to cross-examine him and to raise some questions and to point some counter arguments, it's going to look a little different. So I think one of the theme verses for this impeachment hearing now is going to be Proverbs 18, verse 17. Because we all know, and if you've ever been in a jury, sometimes you'll hear testimony and you'll say, well, that sounds right. And then there are, as a cross-examination or some new evidence is presented, go, oh, I didn't know that. And that's supposed to be what is happening in a court of law. So let's now see how it plays out in front of an open and transparent testimony in front of the American people. So I think you are really onto something there. When it's happening behind closed doors, that causes real concerns. And Steve Scalise, who is the the House Minority Whip, actually had a poster. I've only heard about it, but it says Soviet-style impeachment proceedings, and those words were superimposed upon the image of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. So, okay, it's about time to say, all right, if you really have evidence, let's hear that evidence and let the American people hear it before an actual impeachment vote is taken. So I agree with you.
Yes, and let both sides talk.
And that's,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Both
and that's another
talk,
thing that
not
some people
one.
are concerned about, because they say that even the rules here suggest that Democrats could prevent Republicans from presenting evidence. So we'll see where that goes. The resolution gives Republicans on the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee the opportunity to request witnesses and documents, but Democrats can still block those efforts. So we'll see how fair this process is, and it's going to be with us for months, I suspect.
Right. Thanks.
Well, Kay, thank you very much. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple more issues. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, because the hope was that, for at least some people, that this this final vote on impeachment, up or down, would take place before Thanksgiving. Let's realize tomorrow is November 1st. The House is at least, and I think the Senate is as well, but the House is on recess. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. So this may be strung out over the long period of time. But I'll get into a little more detail. What is some of the response that is coming from the House Republicans? What's some of the response from the House Democrats, as well as from the Senate Republicans, and a couple of other issues? So I'll give you a little more basis to understand what is taking place. But if you're looking for kind of a theme verse that I think is going to run through some of this conversation over the next couple of months, it's Proverbs 18:17. You know, what seems right, when another person comes and examines him, you get a different perspective. So again, that's kind of a paraphrase of Proverbs 18:17, and it's something that we will probably quote from time to time, simply as a biblical way to think about it. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the crime rate is up in many cities, so maybe it's time to consider a solution rarely suggested. Let's see what faith-based organizations and people of faith can do. The evidence is that it can reduce the crime rate and the recidivism rate in our prisons. This is the argument Baylor University criminologist Byron Johnson makes in his book, More God, Less Crime. Sadly, most social scientists and even criminologists seem reluctant to make the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives could have on America's crime problem. Dr. Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message doesn't resonate with most social scientists. Many are even hostile to religion, as demonstrated by the opening chapter in his book entitled The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Dr. Johnson also says that faith-based organizations were merely tolerated within the criminal justice system. In some places, they're seen as valuable and even helpful. In other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. This is unfortunate since the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks and shrinking budgets. Prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, and Kairos Prison Ministry can provide people and programs that can make a difference. Faith-based organizations of all kinds can provide volunteers and educators to help with programs in life skills and adult education. The book is full of positive examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in their local community. He tells the story of the Boston Miracle, where police and pastors worked together to break the stranglehold gangs had in the community. He also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and Violence-Free Zones. He even gives practical advice on the important issues of prisoner reentry and aftercare. Most importantly, he provides a review of the literature so that churches and faith-based organizations can show skeptics that the title of the book is true. More God, Less Crime. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just kind of give you a little bit of an overview on impeachment. And as we were just talking about a minute ago with Kay, this is probably going to be a long-term process. I'm not going to talk about it every day. Of course, you'll hear a lot of other programs talk about it. But our dedication here is to talk about things that are going to be important to your faith, your family, your freedom. I'll spend some time today talking about impeachment. We'll get into so many other issues tomorrow with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. And even before the time is up today, I thought I might at least mention my commentary, More God, Less Crime, and a few other things that do need to be discussed. But for just a minute, let's, if we can, give you some of the background. And that is, of course, I talked about the rules that are being established, which do provide a process by which now the House Intelligence Committee supposedly will have open hearings, release transcripts of some of the closed-door witness testimony, and eventually issue a report. That would then be handed over to the House Judiciary Committee, raising, of course, a big question. What if President Trump or people in his administration refuse to cooperate? Well, then that would be the House Judiciary Committee Chairman, Gerald Nadler, who could then deny requests made by the president. The resolution would give the opportunity for Republicans on the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee the opportunity to request witnesses and documents. But I think in some respects it brings us back to that key verse that we mentioned just a minute ago, Proverbs 18, verse 17, because getting a chance to have a look at what some of these people have said is going to be key. Just a minute ago, I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and he was one who has now become kind of really a hero for some of the anti-Trumpers, because according to the New York Times, in his testimony
behind closed doors. Isn't it amazing how the things that advance the agenda of Adam Schiff and the Democrats make it out of the committee, but everything else stays in there? But he said, I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine. Now, the point that Gary Bauer makes is, first of all, the president did not demand anything, as the transcript of the call shows. Now, some are arguing that the transcript was not complete and some things were left out. Okay, maybe we'll find out. But here's the kind of questions that could be asked by the Republicans. Gary Bauer says, if Colonel Vindman was so concerned about this, why wasn't he concerned when 3 liberal senators threatened Ukraine's bipartisan support if Ukrainian officials did not cooperate with the Mueller report? Where was his concern when Ukrainian officials were scrambling to cover up their support of Hillary Clinton? And all sorts of questions. I appreciate his service, an individual that is a top Ukraine expert on the National Security Council. Don't challenge his ability, but again, when we know that some individuals were hoping that he would also show the Ukrainian officials how to deal with Rudy Giuliani, those are all good questions to be asked in an open testimony, which probably were not asked in the private testimony. Now, there was something that was brought up today, did not happen, but I thought it was a very appropriate question, and that is from Texas Representative Brian Babin. He is, of course, a Republican. He's from the state of Texas, and he actually, in a letter he sent to the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, asked that this vote today would be a voice vote. Let me read from his tweet, since we do have that. It says, instead of an electronic vote on by House Democrats impeachment resolution on Donald Trump, we should stand up and announce out loud our votes. I'm a no, he says, with a capital N-O, in front of our constituents and the nation. I'm leading the effort to ensure that Speaker Pelosi does just that. Now, it is rare that you have a voice vote in the House. There's a very good reason for that. We have lots of voice votes in the Senate, but you have 100 senators. You have 435, actually right now we have 432, but nevertheless, that would be almost 4 times longer, almost 5 times longer for that roll call vote. And so there are reasons that, except for maybe when they vote for a Speaker of the House or some really important pieces of legislation, it's done electronically. But I think this would be important because in one of his statements he made to The Hill, he said, instead of casting our votes on the electric system before leaving town for another recess week, which I mentioned just a minute ago. They're on recess again. Can you believe this? We should all stand before our colleagues and the country to answer the question whether our name is called one at a time, all 432 of us currently in office from Abraham to Zeldin. And I thought that was appropriate because this is a very important vote. A vote, by the way, that even Nancy Pelosi said was very significant. And made it a point that this was something that she was going to pray about. Let me get you the exact quote. She says, this is something that is very solemn, that is something prayerful. What is at stake in all of this is nothing less than our democracy. So if it's that important, why not force everybody to say yes or no on their vote? The 2 Democrats, which I mentioned when we were talking with Kay, that voted against the resolution were individuals, one in Minnesota, one in New Jersey, both representing districts that were won by Donald Trump. And if indeed they're going to vote to impeach Donald Trump, I think we should know how they vote, and they should be able to voice their vote. And if they want to say yes with a resounding shout, or if they want to say no with a resounding comment, they should be free to do so. But just before we take a break, let me mention a couple of other issues that need to be addressed. And one of those is that, as we pointed out the last hour, but let me go through this again, the vote on impeachment doesn't mean removal from office. I think most people understand that, but it's still amazing in some of the polls that I've seen, some people don't understand that. And so this vote is simply to then process this whole case to the United States Senate. At that point, the United States Senate becomes sort of like a courtroom. Sitting as the judge is the Chief Justice of the United States, and sitting as the jury are the 100 senators. And so there have been some question as how seriously the Republicans will take this. this article that appeared today in The Hill, Senate GOP shifts tone on impeachment, that you have some senators, for example, like Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, who, as they say, was the latest Republican senator to express concerns Wednesday, even though he argued that the House has yet to provide any evidence that would actually support removing Donald Trump from office. There are some that have been surveyed who have made statements, for example, one senator from West Virginia saying that the prospect of a quick vote on a motion to dismiss any of the articles of impeachment seems unlikely. That was at least something that was floated originally. Okay, House, you voted to impeach the president. You sent it over here. We've looked at it, and we are simply going to vote against this, to dismiss these articles of impeachment because they're not worthy of any serious consideration. But that is changing. One Republican senator who requested anonymity commented on the internal party discussions, said that Republican colleagues are taking the possibility of impeachment trial seriously as the Democratic-controlled House compiles more evidence. But nevertheless, you have a number of individuals. Let me just pick a few. You have Lindsey Graham, who is a Republican from South Carolina, also the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, saying, I think it would be disposed of very quickly. And you also have Senator Tom Tillis, who is Republican from North Carolina, said, why on earth would we give a platform to something that I judge as a purely political exercise? So even at this late hour here, it seems like there are a number of senators who would quite be willing to vote to dismiss the articles of impeachment or dispose of them quickly. But all of that presupposes that there will be a vote sometime in the near future on articles of impeachment, and there's a long process to go through. First the House Intelligence Committee, then the House Judiciary Committee, then eventually a floor vote. So that's kind of where we are at this point. When we come back from the break, I want to spend some time with our friend Todd Starnes, but let me just mention my commentary today, which is available to you, is entitled More God, Less Crime. It's a very good piece because it's based on the book by Byron Johnson, who's been on the program with us before. He's a criminologist at Baylor University, in which he makes a very clear case that these faith-based organizations have been much more effective in reducing the recidivism rate. Things like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, Kairos Prison Ministry, to mention just a few of many. We've, on this program, talked about various programs to teach Bible school messages and material in the various prison system, even seminary level education in these various prisons. And I don't think that is even up for much debate anymore. Whenever you compare faith-based organizations to secular organizations, they always do better, whether it's drug rehabilitation, whether it's the recidivism rate of prisons, whatever it might be. I think it shows the power of the gospel. It shows the power of the Holy Spirit. It shows that faith-based organization can address many of these issues which have to do with the soul. They're spiritual and psychological issues. And so I would commend to you my commentary today, More God, Less Crime. Let's take a break, though. We'll talk with Todd Starnes about his new book, Cultural Jihad, right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
For final half hour today, we have the privilege of hearing again from Todd Starnes. As I've been mentioning all through the broadcast today, we'll be talking about his book, Cultural Jihad, How to Stop the Left from Killing a Nation. It is almost 300 pages, 18 different chapters. We won't cover all of it in the half an hour we have left, but we'll look at a couple of themes, and certainly some of those have to do with things like religious liberty, political correctness, even the whole issue of gender identification and things of that nature. Todd Starnes is a respected journalist, an award-winning broadcaster, best-selling author. Of course, you know him from Starnes Country on Fox Nation, also a nationally syndicated radio talk show host, and having also commentaries that you can hear on hundreds of stations. And Todd Starnes, welcome back to Point of View.
Kirby, great to hang out with you. Hope you're doing good today.
I'm doing well, and you've improved our day already, because the enthusiasm you have in this book will certainly carry on even after the broadcast. And let's talk about this whole idea of religious liberty. I didn't count how many of the chapters, but there's 18 chapters, but I'd say a very significant number of those that, as we went through, had to do with religious liberty. Now, tomorrow we're going to have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford here. We always talk about religious liberty issues with Kelly Shackelford, even when he's not here on our Friday weekend edition, because that seems to be, if you will, the flashpoint. And it's amazing how many times in your book you're quoting from our People from American Way or individuals, Freedom from Religion Foundation, ACLU, whatever, are challenging what happens in the schools, challenging what happens in the local communities. And you've taken the time to write about some of these very important cases, haven't you?
Yeah, and there's a reason why there are attacks on religious liberty, and I lay out the background in the book, but really the issue here is that our country is at a crossroad. We are either going to go down a path that takes us to freedom and liberty, or we're going to go down a path that takes us to socialism and destruction. And the reason why we have seen an uptick in the attacks on religious liberty is because socialism cannot take over a nation who is under God. We are one nation under God. All of our founding documents were flavored by Judeo-Christian values and precepts. And that's why the leftist and the secularists are trying to target religious liberty, our very first freedom, Kirby. Before they decided to give us the right to bear arms, anything else, the founding fathers sat down and said, you know what, we got to have freedom of religion in this country. And that is the foundational freedom. And I contend in the book that if you chip away at the foundation, the bedrock of our nation, then every one of our other freedoms is going to be jeopardized. And as we demonstrate in the book, and we provide the evidence, every other one of our freedoms is now under attack, from the Second Amendment to freedom of speech to freedom of conscience.
And so I think it just as an illustration, again, that we've got to be ever diligent. And it's the old, what have you given us, a republic or a monarchy? A republic if you can keep it. And you say, my fellow countrymen, I believe we can keep the republic. I truly do, but we must take the pledge taken so many years ago by our founding fathers. Or, again, Ronald Reagan's beautiful speech, a time for choosing. This is not a time, as you say in another part of your book, to go wobbly, is it?
No, it is not. And this is really not necessarily a call to arms, but I grew up in the deep South. I went to a Baptist church, and back then we used to have these week-long revival meetings, and the preacher would typically deliver what we called a hellfire and brimstone message, and that really is what this book is. It's a hellfire and brimstone message to the body of Christ in America, to say, we've got to wake up. We've got to engage the culture. And if we do not do that, then we will lose the republic. I have no doubt about it, Kirby. Sadly, many churches around the country have disengaged from the culture war.
Yes.
The polling data backs all of this up. Many pastors don't want to talk about the hot button issues of the day because they might offend someone. Well, look, we're called to be salt and light, and unfortunately, a lot of Christians are on a sodium-free diet these days.
Well said. Let me, if I can, come back to Chapter 1, because it was very helpful that even as I was describing this, I talk about Freedom from Religion Foundation. We tend to see it's the other guy, but the title of your first chapter is The Cultural Jihadists Live Among Us. And you're talking about being in the gallery there and the various people sitting around you. And the point you're making is that sometimes we think it's us versus them, and that them is out there in the hinterland. No, they could be your next door neighbor. They could be somebody in your family. It certainly could be somebody at the local school, university, whatever. So we have to recognize that the people that are wanting to change our culture oftentimes move among us, and that's why we can't just necessarily have, if you will, an intellectual apologetic assault against certain groups, because they're mixed in among all the population, and there are a lot of those individuals that want to change the culture are people we actually know by first name.
That's right, and many of them are teaching your children in local public schools, and I have a chapter in the book called Reading, Writing, and Radicals.
Yes.
And I talk about how our public schools have become these engines that are driving the social and cultural change in America. You know, just the other day, I published a column about a school district in Austin, Texas. Hundreds, if not thousands, of parents rose up in opposition to a radical sex education policy. And instead of doing the will of the people, the Board of Education decided to go along with these LGBT activists. And they're teaching children as young as third grade how to perform things that we're not even allowed to talk about on the radio because we would be in violation of the FCC rules and regulations. This is the kind of cultural change that I'm talking about. You look at the polling data. There was just a couple of my book's been out for about a month, but there's a new poll out that says a majority of millennials and Generation Zers are embracing communism now over capitalism. These are some frightening things, and we have to wake up. And I do believe that Christians have a unique responsibility to stand up and defend freedom with every breath in our bodies. And again, if we do not do it, we will lose this republic.
Your point's well taken, and as a matter of fact, my heart skipped a beat when you started talking about Austin, because there are some things that some broadcasters have been willing to talk about in the Austin curriculum that I was fearful if they came over the transium here, the FCC would be very upset, because you think of the most debauched, obnoxious, sexually depraved kind of things that you could possibly teach a grade school kid. That's what's being taught. And my biggest problem sometimes is to not want to shock anyone or even try to issue a disclaimer, since I know we have a lot of homeschool parents listening to this. And since we broadcast from Dallas, although we're in 43 different states, I'm well aware of what you're talking about. And it's almost hard to explain how bad it is. And that's probably a good thing, because we still want a level of decorum. But in Chapter 12, Reading, Writing, and Radicals, it is a wake-up call to find out who's on the school board, who's maybe going to run for school board, who's going to be in the Department of Education in your own state, and even to be concerned about who we elect as president, who might actually put someone in the Department of Education as the next secretary. So these kind of ideas being taught to young people are just something beyond the pale. And again, you document this with some significant number of footnotes, so if people want to read it for themselves, they can see how bad it really is.
You know, one of the things that I've been disappointed with the Trump administration about, Kerby, is the Department of Education. I think, I thought Secretary DeVos is doing a terrific job. However, I felt like the only obligation she had was to oversee the dismantling of the Department of Education and return control of the local schools back to the local communities. And I just don't think that's going to happen. I interviewed Franklin Graham for my book, and he said something that was really shocking. He, at least to me, he said that at this point, every Christian needs to pull their children out of public schools. He says they need to either homeschool or put them in a Christian school, but he believes that the public schools are too far gone. Now, the challenge there is I know a lot of moms and dads, Christian moms and dads, good Christian moms and dads who that's not an option. They cannot homeschool. They can't afford private school. So my encouragement is moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, if you've got to send your kid to public school, you better be reading those homework assignments, checking out those textbooks, and taking a very hands-on approach to what your child is learning in that government-controlled classroom.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about political correctness. Is a Make America Great hat modern-day swastika? Are we talking about racist ideas when we hear the phrase, "don't tread on me"? And then I'll take some phone calls, too, 1-800-351-1212. This is certainly a great book for those of you that have children or grandchildren in the public schools to really think about this, as well as some of the great challenges we face in terms of religious liberty. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the challenges we face with a politically correct environment which says we should be tolerant, except we don't want to tolerate any of those Christian ideas, of course. Part of the book, Cultural Jihad. We'll come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Todd Starnes with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Cultural Jihad, How to Stop the Left from Killing a Nation. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Before I take a phone call, Todd, let's talk about this idea of political correctness. It seems to me today that almost anything that used to be an encouragement, something that was seen as a virtue, is now being criticized and vilified, and all sorts of things, as we pointed out just a minute ago, looking at that Texas school district or others, which were always out of bounds, are now being actually celebrated. So you have the classic illustration in Isaiah 5 of calling good evil and evil good. But part of that is this political correctness that has dominated the culture for many years, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and we tell so many stories of that in the book. Of course, the obvious starting point would be the attacks on Chick-fil-A, the official chicken of our Lord, Kirby. Here's what I love about Chick-fil-A. They make a great chicken sandwich, no doubt about it. But you know what? It's even tastier because nothing triggers a liberal faster than a waffle fry from Chick-fil-A. But But, it's really sad. Here we are. It's Halloween. I know a lot of churches have their fall festivals. This time of year, people dress up in costumes. And yet now you have public universities that are threatening to have students arrested if they dress up as, in a sombrero, or maybe they're dressing up as cowboys or Indians or whatnot. It's just unbelievable, the political correctness. I write about Jerry Seinfeld and Larry the Cable Guy.
Yes.
And how they won't even do college university campus.
Yeah.
No, they won't do it. They're afraid to. Here's what gets me. I had to go to one of these HR training sessions, and they were going off and talking about words you can't use, and very reasonable stuff. But they never would say those words, and rightfully so. But when it came time for the white guy, they said, well, there's this cracker who walks in, and I said, cracker. So I raised my hand because, Kerby, you may not know this, but I'm a white guy. I mean, I'm like whiter than Martha White flour. And so I said, wait, you can't say cracker. I said, I'm a saltine American. Thank you very much.
By the way, that's one of the chapters in the book. Yes. Let's see if we can take a phone call or two. Denison, South Carolina, WAGP. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, thank you for taking my call. This is something that's been bugging me for 40 years. And what you said about, I can't think of her name, taking over, overturning the Education Association and bringing things back to the states. I don't think that would do a bit of good, because everybody's in the same boat. Whether it's from the states or from the federal government, it's all the same thing. It's all humanism. I think that 100 years ago, Americans were enthralled with the age of reason and the age of enlightenment and science. And this guy, John Dewey, came on the scene, and he was a humanist. He was an atheist, and he was also called the father of modern progressive education.
Right.
And it was like he was standing in a big rail yard, and he grabbed a hold of that lever and pulled it, and he changed the direction of education. Like a train coming down the normal education track, he changed it. He changed it from a Christian liberal classical education to a humanist education system. People don't look to God for anything when they go through school. If you want to think about immortality, you think about what a scientist could do with cryogenics. You don't think about God. You don't think about your spirit that way, unless it's given to you from your home, but it's not taught to you in school.
Sure.
Those kind of values have nothing to do with anything anymore in any education system.
Let's give Todd just a chance to respond to that real quickly, because, again, we've talked about this on Point of View, that you sometimes have good teachers, you put them in a bad system, the system wins. And so that's one of the things that we have learned over the years about the origin of the modern government school system. And, again, that's one of the reasons why when you read through your book, you just shake your head saying, I can't believe all this has happened. But a lot of it goes all the way back to the 1930s, doesn't it?
It does. And, Dennis, it's a great call, and you raise some really very, reasonable points here. The Age of Enlightenment, the result of that is, unfortunately, we're dumb as rocks now, and I believe that's intentional. When you read through the book, you're going to understand that this is really about the destruction of America as we know it, and it's this fundamental transformation that the previous president talked about. He promised to fundamentally transform America. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that they're ushering in the age of socialism. That's why there are attacks on freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment, because you can't have those three freedoms in a socialist regime. But beyond that, I believe we are looking at the intentional dumbing down of the American population. They're now teaching in public schools to the lowest denominator, not the highest. And I think the reason why is it's a lot easier, fellas. It's a lot easier to control, quite frankly, an ignorant population.
It certainly is. Well, we're just about out of time. I know that Daryl in Georgia want to say how much he appreciates you, but if we go to your website, toddstarnes.com, what will we find? Because I think people can follow your column, your Toddcast, as it's called, some of the other events. Of course, they can get a copy of your book, but I'm sure they'll find it in the local bookstore. But talk about what they will find when they land on your website.
Yeah, we have so many great free resources for folks. We have a weekly newsletter where we send out stories about what's happening around the country. And, of course, we also have our free podcast. We call it the Toddcast Podcast. And that's a freebie as well. And we have a lot of fun talking about the big issues of the day. I do have to tell you this, Kerby, real quick. One of our readers, they felt so inspired, they actually sent me a Culture Jihad T-shirt. And I was very grateful, but I had to explain to them why I would not be wearing that through the TSA checkpoint at the at LaGuardia. that would not end well for Todd Starnes.
No, I don't think it would end well at all. But again, this book is about 300 pages, and it is published by Post Hill Press. I know most people will be able to find it in the local bookstore, but we also have a link there in case you want to get it in hardback or Kindle. And I think it's just a wake-up call and, if nothing else, kind of a manual on how to stop the left from killing a nation, which is the subtitle of the book, Cultural Jihad. And if nothing else, I appreciate the great humor that you bring to the conversations and the research you bring to it as well. And it is always a delight and privilege to have you on with us here on Point of View.
Kerby, always fun. And I want to say hello to Daryl as well. Thank you for listening down in Georgia, and God bless your great listeners.
That's all we have for today. Let me just mention real quickly, we got all sorts of things to address tomorrow, and that is, of course, Point of View's Weekend Edition. We have actually together Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford and Kerby Anderson. When's the last time all three of us were in the same room at the same time? Because of their busyness and because of our trip to Israel and Rome. That has not happened in a while. So if nothing else, I wanted to just give you that opportunity to hear from some of those experts. And so we'll be talking about that tomorrow. Just as we wind down, let me just say that we really enjoyed our trip to Israel and then on to Rome. And for those of you that are part of the broadcasting audience that were part of that, I want to say thank you for joining us. And for those of you that did not have a chance to join us, we'll try to bring you some of the facts and figures, stories, pictures, and things like that in the future. If you go to my Facebook page, I tried to post some pictures every single day so you can kind of follow along there as well. But just before we wind down, let me just mention that my Viewpoints commentary today, more God, less crime. I don't even think it's questionable now that if indeed we have faith-based organizations, that will make a difference. More God, less crime. Don't you think that would be another really important solution? So I thought you might want to read my commentary today, and you can go and find that on the website, pointofview.net. Well, we'll all be back here tomorrow. I know Kelly Shackelford has some things to say about impeachment. Penna Dexter has some things to talk about transgenderism. It'll all be here. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.